Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. The United States has somewhere around 1,000 military bases spread all over the globe. It's the greatest projection of military power in the history of the planet. One place that boasts perhaps the highest concentration of these military bases is the tiny island of Okinawa off of Japan. There are no less than 32 U.S. military bases. There's also a population that has been resisting the presence of these military bases for 70 years. This is a story of military domination, occupation, and determined popular resistance. To help us understand the importance of this domination and resistance, we have the director of a brand new documentary, Okinawa, the Afterburn, JOHN JUNKERMAN. John, welcome to Other Voices.
Thanks very much. It's nice to be here.
For joining us here. Before we get into the film, I want to give a little more introduction about John. He was a graduate of Stanford University, where he studied the Japanese language and Japanese literature, left for Japan shortly after graduation, and has since spent a good part of the past 40 years living and working there, producing documentary films on a range of topics. Some of his previous films include Uminchu. Well, you studied it, I didn't. The Old Man in the East China Sea, featuring the rugged beauty of the Okinawa Island, Yonaguni, and Japan's Peace Constitution, which explored the global significance of Japan's pacifist national charter. And in 2002, his film Power and Terror, Noam Chomsky in Our Times, was the first theatrically released film to raise critical questions about the response to 9/11. A portion of Power and Terror was filmed in Palo Alto at a PPJC-sponsored appearance by Noam Chomsky, and I'm happy to say I'm in that film.
Yes, you are.
We should have shown that tonight instead. Okinawa, the Afterburn, his brand new documentary, has won numerous awards as Best Documentary, and including the influential Mainichi Film Award for Best Documentary. That's a big one in Japan, is that right?
Yeah, it's the prize for documentary, yep.
So I know you have a close connection to the Japanese people, their peace constitution. What inspired you particularly at this time to make this film?
I first went to Japan in 1969, which was at the peak of the Vietnam War, and I was already, opposed to that war. And when I got to Japan, I was very much drawn to not just Japanese culture, but also to its post-war commitment to pacifism. After college, I went back to Japan, and during that stay, I spent 6 months on Okinawa in 1975 and 1976. So the Vietnam War had just ended, but a large part of the Vietnam War was staged on Okinawa.
That was a major...
It was a major staging ground.
For the Korean War, wasn't it?
Exactly, for the Korean War as well. And actually, the B-52s that bombed North Korea and Vietnam both took off from Okinawa. So it was really tied up in that in a very, very real way. I worked with GIs for about 6 months in a GI military resistance, sort of support effort. And I lived right in the central part of the island where the highest concentration of bases are. And it really had the feeling of being not in Okinawa, but being in the United States.
Yeah.
And the bases went on forever. And the people you saw on the streets were Americans. It was really American dominated.
We're going to see some of that when we see some clips. But this actually came out, I think, last year. Is it because it's the 70th anniversary of the
Well, that
end of the
wasn't
war?
exactly the reason, and the more recent, so my commitment to Okinawa stretches back to 1975.
okay.
And I always wanted to do something about Okinawa, but but anyway, it took a long time to get around to it. After I made the Peace Constitution film, it seemed like the logical next film to make. We didn't time it for the 70th anniversary, but that's
Just
in
worked
fact
out
when
that
it
way.
came out. So it got a lot of attention when it was released last year in Japan, right around the anniversary, the 70th anniversary.
Of the
And
end
it
of the
became
war,
one of the films to see in thinking about the war and the post-war period.
Yeah, in doing some background for this program, I saw a 2014 interview you did with Amy Goodman, so I know you were working on it back then.
Yeah, I spent 5 years making this film.
5 years.
Yeah.
It shows in all the archival footage, some of which we'll get to see in a little while. Is there anything more you want to say on that? I'm kind of tempted to go to that intro clip.
Let's get a sample of it and then talk about it. Yeah.
This part is called Prologue, and
It's the beginning of the film.
and it gives you an overview, at any rate, of what's coming in the 2-hour film. You're not going to get to see too much of it tonight, but if control room is ready, let's go ahead and run that first clip.
In May 1853, a United States Navy fleet led by Commodore Matthew Perry entered the port of Naha in the kingdom of Ryukyu. Perry was en route to Japan, where his famous black ships would force the country to open up to the west. Overriding the protests of the Ryukyu government, he came ashore and demanded the right to establish an American outpost. Already at this early date, Perry had conceived a plan to occupy the Ryukyu kingdom, now known as Okinawa, as a toehold for American maritime operations in East Asia. 92 years later, in 1945, after the longest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, the American military claimed Okinawa. Perry's vision of occupying the island had finally become a reality. And now, a further 70 years later, Okinawa today. American bases still occupy 18% of Okinawa, including much of the flatland of this rugged coral island where 1.4 million people live. Okinawa exists as an island of bases, treated with discrimination by both the Japanese and American governments. The most contentious of the 32 American bases is the Futenma Marine Corps Air Station, located here in a densely populated city and known as the most dangerous base in the world.
In 2004, August 13th, the CH-53D Marine Corps helicopter crashed into this building, the administration building, fell to the ground and burned. No one was surprised by that. People were, of course, shocked and terrified, but everybody knew that with a base like that in a crowded city like this, there would be an accident. What was extremely remarkable about it was what happened after that. Marines came streaming over the fence as if they were prepared to do so. Then they occupied this campus.
Hey, no. Out, no, back.
And here these kids, 18, 19 years old in Marine uniforms, shouting orders at their elders, the newsmen, as if they had the authority to come into this foreign country and order the people to do this, that, or the other thing. I'm not sure if they would do the same kind of thing in mainland Japan or in Germany or in Italy. or in Great Britain. I rather doubt it. Maybe in Korea, but certainly in Okinawa.
In 1997, the U.S. and Japan agreed to close the dangerous Futenma base and build a replacement base in a less populated area here in the north. After a delay of nearly 20 years due to strong local opposition to the new base, preparations for construction began in earnest in 2014.
今日は578日目になります。2014年の4月1日からこの座り込みは始まりました。昨日は300名、400名近い人が集まって、ここに座り込んでいました。
当時はですね、小長氏と稲部市長の抵抗にあって、ほとんど知りません。2月1日の産経新聞が報じたように、春まで工事は中止です。すごいことですよ、我々が勝っています。自信を持ってやりましょう。ここ、潰された団結を立て直す時は今腕組んでここへ座り込め工事やめろ作業やめろ工事をやめろ作業をやめろ工事をやめろ
Meanwhile, the existing base in Futenma remains open, and local residents engage in a symbolic protest, attaching ribbons and tape to the fence around the base.
だからもったいないとか中の人たちも言うけれど、あ、どんならあれはもったいなくないの？1機100億円もするぐらいのものを。汚いって言うけど、私たち自身にとってはこのフェンス自体があってはならないものだと思っています。それを撤去させればこんなことしません。
どう見ても汚くはないよね、綺麗だよね。
That was a clip from Okinawa, the Afterburn, directed by my guest, JOHN JUNKERMAN. And we're going to see a little bit more of that later. A really good overview of where we are right now in this 70-year occupation of this. Let's talk about the resistance. I mean, we're in this country right now talking about resistance. Maybe we can learn something. How do they organize it, and what expression does it take? Give us an idea of, we saw some roadside demonstrations. People, is it civil disobedience? Is it lobbying? Is it?
Well, let me give you a little background. The reason the as you saw from the prologue, there's the scope of the film really carries from the Battle of Okinawa, which was a terrible battle that happened at the end of World War II in 1945, and it carries up to the present. And we just decided early on in making the film that you couldn't really understand the depth and persistence of the resistance on Okinawa without examining the battle of Okinawa, because that's really where it's all rooted. The island of Okinawa is about 1/3 the size of Long Island, so it's a small island.
It has 32 military bases.
And it has 32 military bases, but before it had 32 military bases, it was the site of a battle that lasted for 12 weeks, and encompassed primarily the southern half of the island, in which 240,000 people lost their lives, including 150,000 Okinawans, civilians. And Okinawa is an island in the Pacific that, upon which 550,000 American soldiers and 100,000 Japanese soldiers converged and then fought their battle. They hadn't been there before. It wasn't a military base before. It was there in that battle. So that
for the U.S., it was a stepping stone to an invasion of the mainland.
Exactly, it was a stepping stone, and for the Japanese, it was a last bastion. It was a barrier to the invasion of Japan. So they fought tenaciously, with no regard whatsoever for the civilian population of Okinawa. So approximately 1 in 4 Okinawans died during that battle, and so everybody on the island was affected. Either their family or relatives or somebody they knew was killed in the battle. The island was devastated, 90% burned to the ground. So there was nothing there, nothing left there after the war. But the U.S. seized the military bases, the land for the military bases, and already had plans to build bases there before the end of the war, before the war ended.
Yeah, they already knew that they were going to be permanent there.
Right, exactly. So in the early years of the post-war period, the Okinawans worked for the Americans on the military bases because that was about the only thing they could do. But there was always this simmering, resentment and sadness because of the tragedy of the Battle of Okinawa. So there was sort of a split within Okinawa from the very beginning of the post-war period between its dependence on the military and that sense of opposition and really abhorrence of war. So it became a very popular movement. In its early stages, it was not terribly well organized. In the 1950s, it really began to coalesce into a broad-based movement that was centered on rent payments, because in the early stages the U.S. didn't pay any rent, and then when they started paying rent, it was dirt cheap, and but they were occupying all the farmland of Okinawa, so people couldn't farm, no way to make a living other than working on the bases. So there's that dependence upon the bases, but at the same time a strong demand for their return that emerged in the 1950s.
And to be clear for folks, I certainly didn't know a lot of this history until I watched your film and did some research, but up through, I think it was 1972, this was a U.S. possession. There was no Japanese sovereignty or local sovereignty. Right. The U.S. occupied it and ran the place under our imposed laws.
Exactly. The occupation of Japan as a whole ended in 1952. But Okinawa was grandfathered into, the occupation there was continued for another 20 years. Yeah. Was entirely an American administration, with some, autonomous self-government, but primarily an American administered island until 1972. So the movement then became a movement to demand return to Japanese sovereignty, and to on an equal footing with Japan, so that Japan has a peace constitution. The peace constitution would apply to Okinawa. Up until 1972, there were nuclear missiles on Okinawa, targeted on China and Russia and places like that, whole batteries of nuclear missiles.
But
so
not
these,
permitted under the peace constitution.
but not in Japan itself, because they were not allowed in Japan.
But what about now?
Now the nuclear missiles have been removed.
As far as we know.
As far as we know, but there's probably no reason to keep them there, because strategically they're better placed on submarines and on long distance bombers that are in Guam and places like that. So they don't really need to be in Okinawa anymore. So they probably aren't. But
So after what they called reversion, after '72, and Okinawa was reincorporated as part of Japan,
right.
and they started having local elections and things like that. Has that been part of the movement to? First, let me back up a second, because as I recall, the people of Okinawa kind of expected the bases to go away, or most of them to go away, when reversion happened.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. At least to be on the same footing as Japan, but that didn't happen. The political administration of Okinawa returned to Japan, but the bases remained essentially untouched from what they were.
Yeah.
In fact, the percentage of bases of the U.S. has bases in Japan as well, and so the overall percentage of the bases that U.S. has in Japan, now 75% of them are concentrated in Okinawa.
And is that just inertia because they're there, or I mean, it's not much a different location?
Yes, it's inertia. When once the U.S. seizes base land, they tend not to return it.
Yeah.
And so in the early post-war period, they took much more than they needed, but they kept it. So that yes, it's inertia. It's the American sense that we bled and lost lives fighting in the Battle of Okinawa, so we have a right to that territory, the bases on that territory.
Yeah.
It's the spoils of war.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the Japanese also have a discriminatory attitude toward Okinawa, so that in fact, at the time of reversion, 50% of the bases in Japan were located in Okinawa, and the percentage has increased since then. Higher concentration, closing bases in Japan proper and moving them to Okinawa.
That's interesting. Is that because they're not seen as being fully Japanese?
Exactly.
Because they had been an independent, sovereign.
Yes. Yeah.
So after all this, I mean, they were incorporated and taken over by Japan a long time ago.
Yeah, it was a kingdom, but it was a kingdom until 1879, and then Japan annexed it.
Yeah.
So we refer to it as an internal colony of Japan.
Interesting.
Not, and that discrepancy of power and authority has continued to the present.
So in trying to resist these bases, they're kind of one strike against them already, turning to the central Japanese government to assist them in this. And of course, I have to assume the central government, the federal government essentially in Japan, much more values its strategic relationships with the United States than what it's doing to the people of Okinawa.
Exactly. Right.
Talk a little bit more about what it is like now. You mentioned in the 70s, but even now in the 21st century, to live amidst such a huge military presence.
Yeah, there have been waves of opposition, and the latest wave of opposition started in around 1995. There was a notorious gang rape of a 12-year-old schoolgirl by 3 servicemen. And that just, as it had earlier in the past, those kinds of rapes, very notorious rape cases, sort of generate large popular movements in Okinawa. But the latest one was 1995. There were demonstrations with 85,000 people.
Wow.
And it became clear that if something didn't change, the Marine Corps was not going to be welcome in Okinawa, period. They might be facing, entire removal entirely from the island. So they made a deal. They're going to close the base that was introduced in the prologue, the Tenma Marine Corps Air Station, because it's so dangerous. And they agreed to close that, but as part of their deal, they negotiated a replacement facility, they call it, up in the northern part of the island,
It's less populated or
It's
less
less
dense.
populated
Yeah.
and more out of the way and more out of sight.
Yeah.
But it's also on a bay that has very deep waters, so it's a deep water port. So in replacing this air base, they're going to build a air base, fill in the bay, build 2 runways into the bay, but also build a deep water port and have a fully functional base that also includes an ammo depot and logistics areas and such like that. So it's all state-of-the-art base that they're going to replace. And it's going to be a base that will last for 100 years. So the Okinawans, with their deep-seated aversion to war, don't like the idea of building a base that's going to extend their status as an island of bases into the next century.
They're fully aware that it's a 100-year base.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. Plus, it's a pristine and beautiful, richly rich a bay that has rich coral reef, the best the strongest coral reef system in the entire Pacific Ocean, and it's home to thousands of
And I assume
species
that's
of
going to
fish.
get dredged?
It's going to get filled with
Filled.
Yeah, with 35 million truckloads of earth, and it's just a travesty. It's so beautiful, and so there are those 2 aspects of it that have fueled an opposition. So 20 years ago, the agreement was made to close Tema and build this replacement base. But they've made very, very little progress over those 20 years. And so we're basically, the situation has been stalemated in that way all these years.
Yeah.
But with the new Abe Shinzo administration in Japan, Prime Minister Abe, who came back into power in 2012, he put his foot on the accelerator and said, we got to get serious about this. We promised the U.S. we're going to build them this base, and we've got to fulfill that promise. So now everything is coming to a head, and the demonstrations and the sit-ins and the confrontations have intensified very strongly.
All right. The clock is continuing to tick away on us, so why don't we get to the next clip?
Okay.
Tell us what's in this.
This is sort of a historical segment. It begins with the end of the Battle of Okinawa and citizens being moved into relocation camps, and then the bases being built in the land where their villages had been.
And from watching the full movie, I just want to keep your eyes or ears open for some of the propaganda films that our military created. I don't want to use creation as a word of that, but let's go ahead and if we're ready, roll this next clip.
The American military began to capture civilians during the very first days of the battle. By the end of June 1945, more than 300,000 civilians had been moved to 12 detention camps on the island.
From the collection centers, the civil population was evacuated to villages where they would not hinder our military movement. Here at morning muster, all able-bodied men reported to the civil affairs officer in charge for daily instructions and assignments. They were organized into groups with leaders appointed from among themselves, and under our supervision, they helped to govern themselves. They were not being pampered, but in return for a little dignity, they relieved us of many of the minor problems of nursemaiding over 300,000 civilians. Anyway, it was the children of Okinawa that mattered most, and our civil affairs sections realized that candy and kind words, medicine and education and recreation would make them more helpful and useful neighbors to a naval base than their broken-spirited parents. These children were an investment in the future security of an American outpost.
A few weeks after these scenes were shot, the village, portrayed as a model of democratic government, was uprooted.
On Okinawa, the village of Shimobaru gives way to a United States Army airfield, which must be built in its place. Soldiers escort native citizens of the village to their new homes. These enemy nationals on the conquered island are fairly treated by American Army authority.
Immediately after landing on Okinawa, the American military began constructing airfields. By the end of 1945, 10 air bases had been completed throughout Okinawa. After the war, Okinawa and its land were treated as the spoils of war, and the United States continued to occupy the territory as its military bastion in East Asia. Still today, U.S. military bases occupy some 18% of the main island of Okinawa. Within the vast network of American bases that straddles the globe, Okinawa is one of the largest concentrations of bases. Marine Corps bases such as Camp Kinzer, Foster, Hansen, and Schwab carry the names of individual soldiers who died during the Battle of Okinawa and were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Another selection from the film directed by our guest, JOHN JUNKERMAN, Okinawa, The Afterburn. I do want to get to our audience to get them in on the conversation, but before we do that, what does the afterburn part of the title mean?
The Afterburn came to me sort of as a title after I spent about 2 weeks holed up in my cutting room, in the editing room, looking through 100 hours of archival footage of the Battle of Okinawa. And as the battle moved further south, the primary weapon of choice became the flamethrower. And they had developed new advances in the flamethrower during the course of the battle. So it could shoot the napalm or the gasoline for 100 meters into these caves. So the U.S. soldiers stayed back and just burned everything they saw.
You mentioned earlier about 95% of the island, everything was burned to the ground. And you look at that lush greenery at the end of that clip, that is saying something.
Yeah, that's what, the sort of the contrast we wanted to draw there. But the fact is that, so I had watched that, and then that just came to me one day, the Afterburn as a title. I wasn't even sure that it was a word. And but then I looked it up on the internet, and of course, what comes up is the afterburn, after you eat something hot and it sort of burns down your throat. But it also is a psychological term, and it refers to trauma, that the effects of trauma that deepen over time until the cause of that trauma is resolved. And it seemed to me that that perfectly captures what's going on in Okinawa, because the trauma of the Battle of Okinawa has never been resolved, because Okinawa remains a military bastion. And people who lived through that battle have to endure the sounds of jets going over and the tanks running through and the Marines doing live ammunition practice in their hillsides. And people talk about having nightmares about being thrown back into their experiences during the Battle of Okinawa whenever those kinds of things happen, whenever they encounter those kinds of things. So for the Okinawans, really, the Battle of Okinawa has never ended.
You have incredible interviews with a woman who was in her 20s in one of those caves at the end of that battle.
When other people from her village committed mass suicide.
All right, I'd like to turn to the audience. If you have any questions or comments about this, just wait for Crystal to arrive with the microphone. There it is. And if you would stand up and make it easier on our camera folks, that would be great. And hold it right up there.
Welcome.
Thank you.
My name is Donna Smith Powers, and my question is, can you give any examples of active pacifism that the people of Okinawa have done with this tragedy that has come upon them?
The Okinawan resistance has been absolutely nonviolent throughout.
In what way do they resist?
Is it civil disobedience? Or?
They block the gates. Right now, there are construction vehicles that are arriving to make the preparations for building this massive new base. So they line up in front of it and block it, lie down on the ground, link arms, and the riot police, who are there in large numbers, grab them and carry them aside. But it's entirely nonviolent. It's a strong commitment to nonviolence, and it's been that way really throughout the post-war period.
Interesting. Okay, next one's right here. Here's your microphone. If you stand up.
Thank you. When I was stationed in Korea in the early 70s, I got a chance to visit Okinawa, and I remember going to an office or like a coffee shop of anti-war GIs, or there was a congregation of pro-peace servicemen.
Right.
And I was wondering, do you happen to know what happened to that cafe, and specifically or in general, what happened to the anti-war movement amongst the troops there?
If I'm correct in my understanding this situation, it was the very organization that I worked with in Okinawa in 1975. In 1970 to 72, 73 was very active there. It was called the Omega Center, I think, and it was basically there was a group called Pacific Counseling Services that was based in San Francisco, but had offices in various bases around Japan, and they were providing legal assistance. There were National Lawyers Guild lawyers that were providing legal assistance to GIs who were resisting being sent to Vietnam or resisting the military in other ways. And then they also had coffee houses and bookstores and things like that. After 73 or so, as the Vietnamization happened and the U.S. was withdrawing from Vietnam, the resistance diminished some. And by the time I was there in 1975, the war was over, and it was an economic draft, and there was less resistance among GIs. The funding dried up. It moved on to nuclear issues. It was right around 3 Mile Island and things like that. And so that GI counseling work ended around 1976, right around the time that I was sort of the last wave of that. But,
Thank you.
Yeah, interesting question. Somebody else in the audience ready? Okay.
Well, following up on David's question, which is a fascinating thing to hear about, even though the funding was drying up, while you were active with the coffee house, would you say that you saw much awareness amongst the GIs at the coffee house about the situation for the Okinawans themselves, or how was that understood at that time by them?
We did a mimeographed newspaper that we passed out on payday. Sold it for $0.25 on payday on the streets, and one of my jobs was to go around Okinawa and to find out what's going on in Okinawa and to write those up as articles and put them in the newspaper. I think that we reached several dozen people during the course of our work, and it wasn't widespread. There were some black GIs that came into the center and we became friendly with. We went out we cut sugar cane one time with them, sort of with people who were active in the community. So we tried as much as we could to make those links. But the fact is that the bases in Okinawa are so inner directed, and inside that wall, that fence, it's really it is the United States, and even more so now. They explicitly say that they try to make it feel as much like the United States as possible, so that the GIs won't be homesick. So you go inside the bases, and you've got Taco Bell, and you've got McDonald's, and all those kinds of things, and bowling alleys, and swimming pools, and wide avenues, and everything is in English. It's really, the bases are large enough that they have bus routes running inside the bases, and so for the most part, GIs have a very isolated and insulated experience of Okinawa. Then the second thing is that they get indoctrinated by the military when they get there to believe that the opposition that they sometimes see outside is a minority. It's a small percentage of the Okinawan population is against you guys, and all of those guys are commies, and they're on the Chinese payroll and things like that. It's the way they describe it. In fact, when you do public opinion polls in Okinawa, 80 to 85% of the people are opposed to the bases, especially this new base. And it's not just a small minority by any means. In fact, in the last 5 years, with one exception, every single election of town and village and as well as national representatives in Okinawa has been won by the opposition, by opponents of the bases. It's really just, it's a clean sweep. And so it really, truly represents the will of the Okinawan people, which the Japanese government has absolutely ignored. To the extent that they refuse to talk to them, they see them as this, this renegade prefecture out there with all these commies, with all these peace activists and folks that they look down upon, and that they.
It's kind of the Berkeley of Japan.
Yeah, the Berkeley, exactly, right. Something along those lines. But they don't even provide the common courtesy of meeting with their delegations when people from the islands come to Tokyo to meet with people. So, and they continually get slapped in the face. It's a terrible thing to see.
Even though they've been electing these anti-base politicians at all levels, if I'm understanding the news that I crammed down in the last few days, the current governor of Okinawa actually issued an order to stop construction of the base, or would hinder construction of the base.
That's right.
He recently lost a round in the courts or something. Can you say what's going on there?
It becomes kind of a complicated thing, because
We don't have
previous,
enough time to be real complicated.
I know. The previous governor was the central government twisted his arm and essentially forced him to approve the construction of the bases. He was defeated in the next election just 9 months later, and the incoming governor is a strong opponent of the new base and rescinded his approval. And now the government had the central government sued Okinawa to
overturn the rescinding of that order. You can't take it back.
Exactly, exactly. You can't take it back. So that battle, court battle, has been going on. The prefecture recently lost. It's at appeal, but no one has very high expectations of the Japanese courts. So in fact, this battle is going to happen on the streets and at the gates of the base, and not in the courts.
All right, I want to follow up on that. Is there any other question in the audience right now? Okay, right there. While the microphone's getting there, let me ask you this question. If there was a protest movement in this country of some sort targeting the U.S. military, I would be pretty sure that there'd be some kind of surveillance and infiltration. Has any evidence been uncovered of the U.S. military doing that to these protest movements in Okinawa?
Well, it's not just the U.S. military, but also the Japanese government and the Japanese police. There's very heavy surveillance of it. Every time there's a demonstration, there are cameras videotaping everything, and riot police in large numbers controlling the situation. In terms of infiltrating
U.S. involvement that way.
Well, the U.S. does on the other side of the fence. They also run their video cameras, and there's the behind the scenes pulling the strings. But the jurisdiction is Japanese jurisdiction, and in fact, as much as the U.S. is behind all of it, right now the target of the Okinawan opposition is the Japanese government and the Japanese riot police and the Japanese police authorities. So.
Okay, let's go to our audience.
So do you think that if we raise awareness in the U.S. and we bring it up to our government, there'll become more of an impact for the protesters in Okinawa?
I think so, absolutely, yes.
Thank you. That was going to be one of my questions. What do we do here?
In fact, there has been a growing awareness in the United States of the problem of Okinawa. The Berkeley City Council passed a resolution in opposition to the Henoko construction about 2 years ago, I think, and then Cambridge, Massachusetts followed suit. There's an effort in Seattle to also pass a resolution.
And what effect does that have there?
It has a great impact on people's morale. And there's a real sense that even though people are isolated on this distant island and don't get the kind of coverage in Japan or the United States that they should get, there is a sense that people believe that their message is getting heard, and those things are evidence of that, and it really gives them. They feel as if they're making progress every single day, because every single day more and more people know and care about this issue. In fact, within Japan, the concern over this issue is at the highest level that it's ever been in the entire post-war period. And there are large demonstrations over the last 2 years where people gathered and circled the Diet, the parliament office in central Tokyo. The first one had like 12,000 people, and the second one double that. The third one had 30,000 people demonstrating in Tokyo in opposition to this base on Okinawa. It's unheard of for there to be that level of concern. So their voice is being heard, and it's gradually getting into the United States as well.
I imagine you're hoping your film plays a role in this?
Absolutely. I mean, I've been living with 40 years, for 40 years with a sense as an American citizen that I personally am responsible for those bases on Okinawa. And the more Americans who share that sense of responsibility for those bases, the sooner we'll put a stop to them.
I like that you use that term because I think that's responsibility, that it's a sense that we don't often have, that we are responsible even though it's 7,000 miles away or whatever. So I'll go back to the audience in just a sec. I have to ask the obvious question. We have a new president coming in January, and he in fact mentioned Japan several times on the campaign trail, in that Japan doesn't shoulder enough of the burden of the costs of our military bases there.
Well, it just shows how much he understands that part of the world. In fact, Japan spent last year $1.8 billion in shouldering the costs of American bases in Japan. Japan provides more as a percentage of the costs than any other host country in the world. It's something like 80% of the cost. The rent, the utilities, the people who work on the bases, their salaries, everything is covered by the Japanese government.
And
that's one of the reasons.
And that's the monetary cost. It has nothing to do with the quality of life costs to the people who live on
that's true. Yes. Yeah.
Do you think?
I think that if Hillary had gotten elected, we know what would have happened to Okinawa. She is a hawk, and she's the person behind the whole idea of the pivot to Asia. Whether that's strategically a good thing or not is a question. I don't think it's a valuable move to pivot to Asia, but that was her idea. And so I think that from her perspective, she would have demanded that the base be built in Henoko, and there would be no shift whatsoever in the overall framework of that Okinawa operated under. I don't know what Trump is going to do.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows,
including him.
Right, and these ideas that he throws around about Japan, they're rehashing. He's rehashing ideas from the 1980s when there was a wave of Japan bashing, and the autos coming in and things like that.
Right.
Those are all very old
Buy
ideas.
American,
right, exactly. The Japanese are stealing our jobs. Well, that was true maybe in 1985, but it's certainly not true now. The Japanese economy is very weak, and they're not stealing any American jobs. And so he's not working with full command of the information. So
don't we know that?
But he could be influenced. I don't know. I mean, the fact is that anybody with a modicum of common sense would look at the situation in Okinawa and say, this is not helping America's image in Asia. It doesn't help America to see protesters about a new U.S. base day after day being dragged away by old women, 80-year-old women being dragged away by riot police. That is not a good image for the United States to share with the world. And the damage it does in the soft power area to the United States is really it's a cost that somebody should, with any objectivity, would say that cost is not worth paying, and we should give up on that base.
Once more, we've got time for one more quick question.
Well, from what you've said about the pristine bay that will be destroyed by the building of the base, it seems possible that worldwide opposition to this project could also be organized through the environmental communities. So could you say more about that, please?
Yeah. Greenpeace has already made the protection of Oura Bay and the stopping Hinako a major campaign issue. They've issued videos that are up on Facebook and places like that. So there's been that end of it. There were also suits filed to protect the bay in American courts. Unfortunately, they won the suit, but they were unable to enforce it in that sort of situation. But the awareness is there, and it's spreading, I think. So yes, there's that side of it. Veterans for Peace also has made Okinawa a central campaign issue.
Yeah.
They had a delegation there. They've had several delegations to Okinawa over the last year. And there is a Veterans for Peace chapter now in Okinawa.
Really?
So yeah, just starting up, but spreading the word and making those links. Another thing that's happened recently that's real interesting is that there have been solidarity moves between the sit-in and the picket line in Hinako and the one in North Dakota and the pipeline in Standing Rock.
Fascinating.
And people are making that, drawing that connection, environmental issues and indigenous people. There's a rough equivalency there.
Yeah, I think and I hope we're going to see actually a lot more of that as we enter this scary new era.
Mm-hmm.
Quickly, in just our last minute or so here, is your film going to be playing theaters in the United States?
No, it's not. It's
No.
The DVD was released on October 25th, so it's available on at the First Run Features website. It's also online and on iTunes.
Okay,
so
we're going to have to let it go there.
Yeah.
Okinawa, the Afterburn, Director John Junkerman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been watching Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you all for coming.